everyone. My name is Lonnie Best. I'm manager of detection and response services at Rapid7. I've been with the company for about a little over 6 years in the SOC, living the life of a SOC analyst, and for the last few years as a manager of a team of analysts in our Arlington, Virginia SOC for our managed detection and response service. Today we're going to be talking about lessons from the SOC and analyzing and remediating cloud attack paths. So we're going to take a look at some real-world incidents, kind of dive into those, and some ways to do things better than others, if you will. So go ahead and dive right in. Real quick, just want to go over a little bit about Rapid7, who we are. At our core, we're a security company. People may know us for lots of various different things. Metasploit framework, people open up MSF console to hack into things and they see that Rapid7 name. A lot of people know us for that. A lot of people know us for what we've been in the business for a really long time, which is vulnerability management, but we're like a lot more than that. Yes, we do have leading products, a lot of which if you want to go get demos of over at our booth, obviously you could do that afterward. We also are a services company. I work in one of those services and manage detection and response, but we provide a lot of other services as well, managed and otherwise. But one of the big things that I really like to highlight is a lot of our research and community-focused efforts. So Attacker KB, that's a database of vulnerabilities, but it's really ranked by security professionals on the usefulness of those vulnerabilities. The Metasploit framework, of course, speaks for itself. And Velociraptor digital forensics and incident response tool, I'm super pumped about that we acquired that a couple of years ago. It's been super, super handy in all of our incident response engagements that we performed in the last few years. But we also do a lot more than that. We have some global networks of honeypots, global internet scanning, so that we can really take a lot of that info and distill it whenever there's something that's, kind of coming up in the news, in the Twitterverse or the Xverse, I guess now, and sort of bring to light, useful information for organizations like yourselves. But that's who we are. We are a security company, and yeah. So we're going to talk, like I said, a little bit about some real-world scenarios having to do with some cloud security incidents. And the first one I want to start off with is one that we actually worked in our managed detection and response and incident response service. And I call it the threat actor playground because, as you'll see, the threat actor who compromised this AWS environment, they just kind of like used it as their own personal playground. So what happened? How was this first identified? So this particular incident, this customer was kind of going through their day-to-day, let me go through and see what's going on in my AWS tenant, checking their logs. They happened to notice some funky activity from one of their root user accounts. And based on the activity that was going on, so they were observing this root account, creating some additional IAM users, performing some sort of reconnaissance type activity. The customer sort of surmised like, hey, this doesn't look like something normal in my environment. I suspect there's something up. So what did they do? Well, they were an MDR customer, so they picked up the phone and contacted our 24/7 MDR hotline. They spoke with one of our customer advisors, customer advisor team. Those are the sort of customer-facing folks in the MDR service, the ones who work with them day in and day out to help mature their security programs. And the customer advisor team took all of the info that the customer had, the weird things that they were seeing, and relayed that information back to our SOC analysts so that they could start their investigation. And that's what they did. So our SOC analysts began investigating the customer's CloudTrail logs that they were ingesting into the Insight IDR SIM platform, as well as some other corollary evidence from some different log sources to start trying to paint a picture of what exactly occurred in this customer environment. Why exactly were they so concerned about what was going on? And it became pretty apparent pretty quick to the SOC that there was a little bit more going on here. This needs a bit more hands-on. And so they escalated this particular incident to our incident response consultants. And in our MDR service, our incident response consultants, they sit side by side with us. Essentially, they're part of our managed services. So we're able to really quickly pivot over into that incident response engagement and see what was really going on. So I'm going to break down some of the stuff that this threat actor did that we identified in their environment, and I'm going to break it down by some, sort of how it maps to different techniques in the MITRE attack matrix. So we'll go ahead and start with initial access. And I'm going to go ahead and open up this talk with the most anticlimactic thing that you're going to get out of this talk. How did this threat actor gain access to this customer's AWS environment? We never found out. Ultimately, during the investigation, the customer wanted to pretty rapidly get things remediated, and unfortunately, we lost some of the data that we would have needed to be able to continue our investigation, to be able to determine ultimately what was the root cause of this incident. So that was unfortunate. It definitely happens all the time in this world. You work with the evidence you have. However, what we do know is there was probably a pretty likely cause, and that's the same cause to a whole lot of incidents that happen in customers' AWS instances, and that's they probably had some hard-coded credentials somewhere. Threat actor gained access to those. Boom, boom, boom. They had the access that they needed. So moving on to the discovery phase. So the threat actor, we observed them performing just a whole bunch of common API calls in the customer's AWS instance. Some of the more common ones were to describe key pairs, list access keys, and in general just list a whole bunch of stuff. They were just gaining information, hence discovery. One of the things they also, the API they queried was the list MFA devices, which was interesting. That obviously we always push MFA on folks. That's the number one way we say to try to prevent access. But when you already got a threat actor in there and they're able to list these MFA devices, you're already fighting a losing battle at that point. One of the other really interesting things that they did too was query some of the various APIs, including the get send quota API. What that does is essentially it lists the different quotas for sending, processing messages for the simple email server SES service in AWS. And that's going to kind of come into play a little bit later in some of the findings that we had during the incident. Moving on, credential access. So this threat actor was able to not only compromise the aforementioned root account, they in total compromised 5 user accounts within this AWS tenant. They also were able to harvest session tokens, and they were able to decrypt and download an SSH key pair. So again, they're getting a good bit of access beyond what they already had to begin with. In the execution phase, this threat actor created a SageMaker role. And then after creating that SageMaker role, they then created multiple Jupyter notebooks. Unfortunately, as with the initial access phase, we were unable to determine what the contents of those notebooks were, but we did see and observed during the investigation that they performed this type of activity. Persistence. The threat actor created a grand total of 8 user accounts within the AWS instance in order to maintain persistent access. And then finally, we get to the impact stage. Of course, these aren't all of the MITRE. These were just the ones that we were able to map in this particular instance. This threat actor stood up a Lightsail instance. Now, we talked earlier about them doing all this stuff with MFA devices, the fact that they got a bunch of keys, the fact that they were using the get send quota to see how much email they could send out and process through this AWS instance. Based on the fact that they then later on stood up a Lightsail instance, sort of points to the fact that they were very likely using this infrastructure to stand up their own phishing infrastructure. So, getting set up to be able to send out a bunch of phishing emails, hosting the phishing credential harvester on this Lightsail instance. So, very likely setting the stage for further attack. So, it was pretty lucky in this instance that the customer identified the problem when they did, so that we were able to take appropriate remediation actions, perform the investigation. Unfortunately, they performed the remediation actions a little bit sooner than we would have liked, but that's a business decision that they needed to make. But no further impact resulted from this particular threat actor activity. So again, like I said, a veritable playground for this threat actor. They did a whole bunch of stuff, but probably ultimately in support of at least one very big singular goal. Now, all of that was done, sort of like I said, stemmed from the customer just doing their day-to-day business and then coming across whatever they found. And then us in the MDR SOC and our incident response team going through a whole bunch of manual data, trying to piece things together and figure out exactly how they all fit to figure out what exactly the threat actor was doing. It would have been really nice if we had a bit more context up front, and if the customer had a bit more context up front in order to be able to sort of paint out the attack pathways. And so at Rapid7, one of the things we recently released, this has been redacted a little bit, but we call this attack path analysis in our Insight CloudSec platform. And what this does is it enables you from sort of the edge to be able to figure out exactly what pathways exist for someone, some unauthorized user, some threat actor, to be able to ingress into your cloud environment. And then what are they able to do from there? So I know the text is a little small here, but if you really pivot from the public internet over on the left here, getting through sort of their firewalls, how are those related ultimately to a particular account that has enough permissions to do things like stand up EC2 instances, to be able to access particular credentials and things of that nature. This attack path, if you have a visual representation of something like this up front at the beginning of an investigation, when you start noticing something weird, or prior to when you're sort of analyzing your attack surface, you can actually utilize something like this pretty well to be able to more quickly identify and remediate activities within the environment. Just going to touch real quick on some research that Rapid7 has done. I really want to focus on sort of the middle of this slide here. So based on some research we've done, more mature cloud programs result in 7 times more likely containment within a very short time frame, and also 7 times more likely ability to monitor and manage your cloud hardening. So we're here at a cloud conference talking about AWS stuff. It's very beneficial to be able to identify these things early on in order to maintain good hygiene as well as detect and remediate attacks. So how can we do that a little bit quicker, I guess, at that point? Most of you have probably heard of, at this point, of security orchestration and automation, or SOAR is the common term. If we can utilize elements of SOAR in this whole process here, so looking at the attack path and then also spinning up remediation, we can be a lot more effective and a lot quicker in our remediation. So moving into one additional, much more common real-world scenario, crypto mining. Most of you are probably aware that a lot of the time what threat actors like to do when they are able to mass exploit anything or get access in particular to an EC2 or into an AWS environment, they like to spin up compute resources to mine cryptocurrency. They do it all the time. They do it on whatever the heck has a GPU that exists out there that they can touch on the internet. So in this case, we had an instance of a customer, and this customer was a little bit mature. They had a tagging policy in place wherein if you didn't tag a host with a particular tag and something got spun up, it would just, the automation would just automatically shut down that resource. In this case, one of the security developers lost their AWS access key. An unauthorized user in Chechnya, based on geolocation, then utilized that to spin up 104 24x large EC2 instances in order to mine Monero. Super common, yeah, we got it. But in this case, because of the fact that they were using this automation, they were able to essentially just automatically use that tagging policy to then pick that up, automatically update the resource permissions and shut down those resources. Ultimately, in this case, it would have cost this customer about $9,000 a day if this threat actor had been able to continue mining Bitcoin. In this case, it cost them $160 because of the automation. So the big play there is that, and a big old dollar sign there, is that if you are maturing your security program, analyzing attack paths, keeping a close eye on your resources, you're able to potentially save your organization a heck of a lot of money, which is going to resonate probably really well to the C-suite when they're analyzing that budget for the next year. So this is just a good pivot real quick over into, this is all part of, for Rapid7, part of our Cloud Risk Complete offer. I'm not going to go into it. We have a booth over here. If anybody wants to go follow up, get any demos or anything like that, happy to chat with you all. I'll be sticking around probably for a bit if anybody wants to just talk about fun incident response stuff. I've been doing it for a while, and I'm happy to do it. But yeah, I just want to thank everybody.